Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our buddy read of Anthony Trollope's last serious great novel, Mr. Scarborough's Family, which he wrote in the early 1880s, right before he popped his clogs. This is a story of a wealthy landowner named Mr. Scarborough who decides to disinherit his oldest son, a spendthrift gambler named Mountjoy, by declaring to the world that he is not legitimate. Uh, this shocks Mountjoy Scarborough, who repairs to a quiet little house in Cheltenham to tell his first cousin, Florence Mountjoy, all about it before she can hear the worst of it from other people. They have long been informally affianced. No, nothing official has ever been said, but it has been assumed by all and sundry that they will marry. But unbeknownst to Captain Scarborough, Florence's heart is pledged elsewhere. And when he forces her, when he opens the subject and forces her to say, I want us to pledge to each other despite what you might hear that my father has done, well, then she's forced to say that she can't do that, and he automatically and correctly assumes there must be someone else. And he also correctly assumes who that someone is. He knows the person. The person is not named in the chapter. The other man is not named in the chapter. Because Trollope was serializing this stuff, and he wanted every possible reason for you to keep going. Now we get chapter 3, which is all about the other man, Harry Annesley. So we'll just read about him. This is chapter 3. Together with Augustus Scarborough at Cambridge had been one Harry Annesley, and he it was whom the captain in his wrath had sworn to put an end if he should come between him and his love. Harry Annesley had been introduced to the captain by his brother, and an intimacy had grown up between them. He had brought him to Tretton Park when Florence was there, and Harry had since made his own way to Cheltenham and had endeavored to plead his own cause after his own fashion. This he had done in the good old English plan, which is said to be somewhat loutish, but is not without its efficacy. You're the suave lover, aren't you, Tony? He had looked at her and danced with her, and done the best with his gloves and his cravat, and had let her see by 20 unmistakable signs that in order to be perfectly happy, he must be near her. Her gloves and her flowers and her other little properties were sweeter to him than any sense, and were more valuable in his eyes than precious stones. But he had never as yet actually asked her to love him. But she was so quick a linguist that she had understood down to the last letter what all those tokens had meant. Her cousin, Captain Scarborough, was to her magnificent, powerful, but terrible withal. She had asked herself 1,000 times whether it would be possible for her to love him and to become his wife. She had never quite given even to herself an answer to this question till she had suddenly found herself unable to do so by his overconfidence in asking her to confess that she loved him. She had never acknowledged anything, even to herself, as to Harry Annesley. She had never told herself that it would be possible that he should ask her any such question. She had a wild, dreamy, fearful feeling that, although it would be possible for her to refuse her cousin, it would be impossible that she should marry any other, while he should still be desirous of making her his wife. As usual here in passages like this, and because he barely blotted a line and almost never rewrote, he runs into a little bit of pronoun problems here, but you get what's being said here. And now Captain Scarborough had threatened Harry Annesley, not indeed by name, but still clearly enough. Any dream of her own in that direction must be a vain dream. As Harry Annesley is going to be what is generally called the hero of this story, it is necessary that something should be said of the particulars of his life and existence up to this period. Oh, Tony. Mr. Scarborough is your hero, you moron. There will be found to be nothing very heroic about him. He is a young man with more than a fair allowance of a young man's folly. It may also be said of a young man's weakness. But I myself am inclined to think that there was but little of a young man's selfishness, with nothing of falseness or dishonesty, and I am therefore tempted to tell his story. Now we get the story. He was the son of a clergyman, and the eldest of a large family of children. But as he was the acknowledged heir to his mother's brother, who was the squire of the parish of which his father was the rector, it was not thought necessary that he should follow any profession. This uncle was the squire of Buston, and was, after all, not a rich man himself. None of these people really are swimming in money. Maybe Mr. Scarborough, but even his wealth has been drastically overestimated. His whole property did not exceed $2,000 a year, an income which 50 years since was supposed to be sufficient for the moderate wants of a moderate country gentleman. But though Buston was not very far removed from the center of everything, being in Hertfordshire and not more than 40 miles from London, Mr. Prosper, that's the Squire of Buston, lived so retired a life and was so far removed from the ways of men that he apparently did not know that his heir was as completely entitled to lead an idle life as though he were the son of a duke or a brewer. It must not, however, be imagined that Mr. Prosper was especially attached to his nephew. He's a piece of work. We're going to meet more of him. I can't help but think a little piteously of the rest of the children of the rector of Buston. Harry Annesley is the presumed heir of the squire and also the oldest son, but what about all the other children? We're going to hear a little about what they suffer, but what are their prospects in life? But anyway, when the boy left the charter house where his uncle had paid his school bills, he was sent to Cambridge with an allowance of £250 a year, and that allowance was still continued to him with an assurance that under no circumstances could it ever be increased. At college he had been successful and left Cambridge with a college fellowship. He therefore left it £175 added to his income, and was considered by all those at Buston Rectory to be a rich young man. But Harry did not find that his combined income amounted to riches amidst the world of idleness. At Buston he was constantly told by his uncle of the necessity for economy. Indeed, Mr. Prosper, who was a sickly little man of about 50 years of age, always spoke of himself as though he intended to live for another half-century. He rarely walked across the park to the rectory, and once a week on Sundays entertained the rectory family. A sad occasion it generally was to the elder of the rectory children, who were thus doomed to abandon the loud pleasantries of their own home for the sober Sunday solemnities of the hall. I like the sound of that, loud pleasantries. Some of you have homes like that. I envy that. That's always wonderful. It was not that the Squire of Buston was a particularly religious man, or that the rector was the reverse, but the parson was joyous, whereas the other was solemn. The squire, who never went to church because he was supposed to be ill, made up for the deficiency by his devotional tendencies when the children were at the hall. He read through a sermon after dinner, unintelligibly and even inaudibly. At this his brother-in-law, who had an evening service in his own church, of course was never present. But Mrs. Annesley and the girls were there, and the younger children. But Harry Annesley had absolutely declined, and his uncle, having found out that he never attended the church service, although he always left the hall with his father, made this a grounds for a quarrel. Presumably at some point it had been either said outright, the lie, or had been implied that Harry was leaving with his father in order to go to his father's service, but he isn't doing that. He doesn't want to go to anybody's services. It at last came to pass that Mr. Prosper, who was jealous and irritable, would hardly speak to his nephew, but the £250 went on with many bickerings on the subject between the parson and the squire. Once, when the squire spoke of discontinuing it, Harry's father reminded him that the young man had been brought up in absolute idleness in conformity with his uncle's desire. It's a pretty heavy ethical club to hold over the squire. It's because of your promises that Harry was never educated in a profession. You did this to him. If you suddenly withdraw this, well, he's ruined. You've ruined him. This the squire denied in strong language, but Harry had not hitherto run loudly in debt, nor kicked over the traces very outrageously, and as he absolutely must be the heir, the allowance was permitted to go on. There was one lady who conceived all manner of bad things as to Harry Annesley because, as she alleged, of the want of a profession or of any fixed income. Mrs. Montjoy, Florence's mother, was this lady. Florence herself had read every word in Harry's language, not knowing, indeed, that she had read anything, but still never having missed a single letter. Mrs. Montjoy also had read a good deal, though not all, and dreaded the appearance of Harry as a declared lover. In her eyes, Captain Scarborough was a very handsome, very powerful, and very grand personage, but she feared that Florence was being induced to refuse her allegiance to this sovereign by the interference of her other very indifferent suitor. What would be Buston and 2,000 a year as compared with all the glories and limitless income of the great Tretton property? Captain Scarborough, with his mustachios and magnificence, was just the man who would be sure to become a peer. She had always heard the income fixed at 30,000 a year. What would a few debts signify to 30,000 a year? I already know he owes well over 100,000. Such had been her thoughts up to the period of Captain Scarborough's visit, when he had come to Cheltenham and had renewed his demand for Florence's hand somewhat roughly. He had spoken ambiguous words, dreadful words, declaring that an internecine quarrel had taken place between him and his father. But these words, though they had been very dreadful, had been altogether misunderstood by Mrs. Mountjoy. The property she knew to be entailed, and she knew that when a property was entailed, the present owner of it had nothing to do with its future disposition. Captain Scarborough, at any rate, was anxious for the marriage, and Mrs. Mountjoy was inclined to accept him, encumbered as he was now with his father's wrath, in preference to poor Harry Annesley. The upshot of which being Mrs. Mountjoy is pretty dumb. In June, Harry came up to London, and there learned at his club the singular story in regard to old Mr. Scarborough and his son. Mr. Scarborough had declared his son to be illegitimate, and all the world knew now that he was utterly penniless and hopelessly in debt. That he had been greatly embarrassed, Harry had known for many months, and added to that was now the fact, very generally believed, that he was not and never had been the heir to Tretton Park. All that still increasing property about Tretton, on which so many hopes had been founded, would belong to his brother. An important note there. It's not just that the Delft works at Tretton are valuable. It's that they're increasing in value. So these local exaggerations as to Mr. Scarborough's income could someday be true. Harry, as he heard the tale, immediately connected it with Florence. He had, of course, known that the captain was a suitor to the girl's hand, and there had been a time when he thought that his own hopes were consequently vain. Because what chance does he have? £250 as a gift from a cranky old man who could stop it at any moment, versus the heir to Tretton Park. What possible competition could he be? Gradually, the conviction dawned upon him that Florence did not love the grand warrior, that she was afraid of him, rather, and awestruck. It would be terrible now were she brought to marry him by this feeling of awe. Then he learned that the warrior had gone down to Cheltenham, and in the restlessness of his spirit he pursued him. When he reached Cheltenham, the warrior had already gone. So poor Captain Scarborough. He goes down to Cheltenham, and not only do creditors follow him, but Harry Annesley follows him as well. The property is certainly entailed, said Mrs. Mountjoy. He had called at once at the house and saw the mother, but Florence was discreetly sent away to her own room when the dangerous young man was admitted. It's going to be tough, in fact, impossible, for Harry Annesley to get this through Mrs. Mountjoy's head. The property is certainly entailed. He is not Mr. Scarborough's eldest son at all, said Harry. That is, in the eyes of the law. Then he had to undertake the task, very difficult for a young man, of explaining to her all the circumstances of the case. But there was something in them so dreadful to the lady's imagination that he failed for a long time to make her comprehend it. Do you mean to say that Mr. Scarborough was not married to his own wife? Not at first. And that he knew it? No doubt he knew it. He confesses as much. But what a very wicked man he must be, said Mrs. Mountjoy. Harry could only shrug his shoulder. And he meant to rob Augustus, that's the second son, all through? Harry again shrugged his shoulder. It is not much more probable that if he could... Is it not much more probable that if he could be so very wicked, he would be willing to deny his eldest son in order to save paying the debts? Harry could only declare the facts as he was told them, or at least as all London believed them to be. That at any rate, Captain Mountjoy had gambled so recklessly as to put himself forever and ever out of reach of a shilling of the property, and that it was clearly the duty of Mrs. Mountjoy, as Florence's mother, not to accept him as a suitor. It was only by slow degrees that the conversation had arrived at this pass. Harry had never as yet declared his own love either to the mother or daughter, and now appeared simply as the narrator of this terrible story. But at this point it did appear to him that he must introduce himself in another guise. The fact is, Mrs. Mountjoy, he said, starting to his feet, that I am in love with your daughter myself. And therefore you have come here to vilify Captain Scarborough. I have come, said he, at any rate to tell the truth. If it be as I say, you cannot think it right that he should marry your daughter. I say nothing of myself, but that at any rate cannot be. It is no business of yours, Mr. Annesley, except that I would fain think her business should be mine. But he could not prevail with Mrs. Mountjoy, either on this day or the next, to allow him to see Florence, and at last was obliged to leave Cheltenham without having done so. So we are introduced to, that is the chapter, and we are introduced to Harry Annesley, and he is a typical Trollope young protagonist, the kind of basically two brain cells to rub together ninny that Trollope always calls the hero of his book, even though no reader will ever agree with that. It's a Victorian stipulation. Your Victorian hero must be a gallant, handsome young man. I think it's ironic and maybe a little telling, that Trollope, of all the panoply of characters that he gives us, valiant, handsome young men, he does the worst. They are almost always vacuous morons. They're almost always empty sets. As I mentioned in a couple of chapters ago, his old men are always fascinating, even when they're rogues or outright villains. They're always fascinating. His young women often end up with more spirit than they seem at first. Not always, not always, but sometimes they end up with more spirit than we at first think. And the older women who've seen the world, who've been around the block a few times, there's one of those in this book that we have yet to meet. They're incredible creations, just incredible. They're amazing. And Trollope does all of that really well. I don't think he's quite as good as writing ordinary common folk, rude mechanicals, as he thinks he is. But he does a passable job with them. We saw that in The Warden. But his young men, Phineas Finn type characters, they are all the same. They are all incredibly handsome. They don't know they're handsome. They're not vain. They are all relatively valiant. They won't be put hands on. They won't be vilified. They all get into trouble and usually need someone more capable than them, someone more intelligent than them to get them out of trouble. And we are now introduced to the central one of those in this book. I'm afraid Harry Annesley doesn't get much more interesting as a person in the course of the novel. But interesting things do happen to him, starting in the next chapter. Because what do we have set up now? This chapter didn't do much, right? It told us who he is, who Harry is. An upstanding, intelligent young man. Intelligent, at least as far as school is concerned. He is the unacknowledged but probably inevitable heir to a minor squire. He has a fixed allowance from that squire and no other income, and no ability to earn income. And one other thing. He's in love with Florence Montjoy. And so is Captain Scarborough. And what has Captain Scarborough said? He didn't name Harry Annesley when he had his one disastrous interview with Florence. But what did he say? That if he comes between me and you, I will kill him. So, as we rocket into the next chapter, the natural question is, well, Captain Scarborough went down to Cheltenham. He talked to Florence Montjoy. He left, went back to London. Then Harry Annesley goes down to Cheltenham to try to talk to Florence Montjoy. Her mother won't allow it. He talks to her mother. And then he leaves and goes back to London. So what happens if the two of them meet? Well, join me in the next chapter. Thank you, BookTube.